Tonight we are thrilled to be hosting Clifford Thompson, author of What It Is, which was named one of Time's most anticipated books of fall 2019. Thompson is an award-winning journalist, essayist, and professor. He is also the recipient of the Whiting's Writers Award for Nonfiction in 2013 for Love for Sale and Other Essays. What It Is focuses on a Black writer's search for answers regarding race and what it means to be American in the Trump era by talking to Trump supporters directly. Taking a page out of Joan Didion's playbook, Thompson assesses the state of his racial temperament through reporting and reflection. Please help me welcome Clifford Thompson to Politics and Prose.
Hello, is this good? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you all for coming. It's really great to see you here, and it's an honor to be here. Thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting this. I'll read the introduction and the first chapter of my book. Before I do that, just to give you an idea of how the book is laid out, it consists of 5 chapters. The first couple of chapters trace my life and the development of my thinking from childhood to adulthood, up to the election of Donald Trump, which was an event that challenged a couple of long and deeply held beliefs of mine. And so at that point, I felt the need to get a sense for myself of what was going on in the country. And to that end, I went to different parts of the country and I talked to a small but very disparate group of Americans about their attitudes, including 3 people who supported Donald Trump for president. So the third and fourth chapters contain the in-depth interviews I did with those people, and the 5th chapter kind of reflects on the whole. So I actually have more time to read than I thought. I was going to read the introduction to you. It seems like I ought to read the introduction and the first chapter. And when I was looking at the first chapter just in the room just now, it gave me pause. The prospect of reading this out loud actually gave me a little bit of pause because I won't say that my attitudes have done a 180 exactly, but they have been modified somewhat over the years. And so in reading the first chapter, I am sort of laying myself bare for you, but I guess that's what writing is all about, right? Or ought to be about. So with that, I'll put on my old man specs and so I can actually see what I'm doing. All right, so this is the introduction to What It Is. I am a black man, Brooklyn-based, 54 years old as I write this. For nearly as long as I can remember, there has been, at the core of my being, making me who I am, or who I feel that I am, the belief that I must treat everyone as an individual, that I must not base my judgments on anything as inconsequential as skin color. And for most of my adult life, I have chosen to see myself as an American, because of the contributions black people have made to this country, because of how inextricably this country is tied to my heritage, and despite white racist belief that the country is theirs more than it is mine. Living according to these principles has sometimes been tough. In my late teens and 20s, moving from the all-black environment where I grew up to integrated circles in college and beyond, I sometimes felt like the only black person I knew who was not reluctant, because of distrust, dislike, or both, to be in the predominantly white settings where my interest often took me. I clung stubbornly to my beliefs, and in my mid-20s I found what I considered to be support for my point of view when I picked up, somewhat belatedly, the books of James Baldwin. Leaving aside for a moment the music of Baldwin's sentences, the grandness of his vision, the wisdom and lyricism he brings to expressing the anger and ache of being black in America, he was the first model I found of one who brought everything he had to bear on opposing racism without being racist himself. His fiction, particularly the underappreciated Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, and his nonfiction, none more eloquent than The Fire Next Time, are the work of a man who rages at injustice but loves deeply and without regard to pigmentation. While the assassinations of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, along with other aspects of the backlash against the civil rights movement, left Baldwin embittered and disillusioned, they did not ultimately compromise his humanity or make him into a racist. He remained, for me, a model of how to conduct oneself with regard to race. And yet I still felt some confusion. There was one substantive difference between me and the white people in my circle. Being white, I discovered, seemed to make one exempt from the question of who one is. They were Americans, these white people, and it never seemed to occur to them, and certainly no one ever indicated to them that they should think otherwise. Many black people, of course, are exempt from this question of who they are, too, by virtue of living and working largely or wholly among other blacks. But if a person's life and interests take him, as mine have taken me, to places where he looks different from most others, that person may begin to ask where the similarities between himself and these others end, and the differences, beyond the obvious one, begin. What the basis for these similarities is, and what the basis for the differences is, and into which camp, similarity or difference, nationality falls. And with regard to the very question of whether nationality constitutes a bond or barrier between oneself and others, the basis of this question is an unspoken assumption that runs so deep, that is reinforced so often and in so many ways, that I passed 3 decades of life on Earth before I questioned it. The assumption that being American means being white. At best, the place of blacks in all this seemed to be the one described by the comedian Chris Rock, who said that for us, America is like the uncle who molested you and then paid for your college education. As much as I would like to say that I began to question that assumption on my own, I had help. It was the work of the essayist Stanley Crouch, which in turn led me to the work of his mentor, and soon to be mine, Albert Murray, that opened my eyes. Murray's books, beginning with the Omni-Americans, proposed an alternate view, that America, rather than being simply a white monster that feeds on people of color and that only the most self-hating of dark-skinned folks would identify with, is in fact largely a black creation, in terms of everything from culture to physical labor, and that the blood, sweat, and investment of generations of blacks makes America our home as much as it is anyone's. According to this view, the struggles blacks have historically faced have provided the obstacles over which we demonstrated the ability to triumph. As Murray wrote in the Omni-Americans, quote, "The legendary exploits of white U.S. backwoodsmen, keelboatmen, and prairie schoonermen become relatively safe when one sets them beside the breathtaking escapes of the fugitive slave, beating his way south to Florida, west to the Indians, and north to faraway Canada through swamp and town alike, seeking freedom. Nobody was chasing Daniel Boone." End quote. To say I am an American, then, is not an act of capitulation, but the first step toward claiming one's birthright, recognizing the setting of one's ancestors' triumphs and adventures. It is tantamount to saying, I am home. The symbol for this idea, the art form that allows me to celebrate this notion of laying claim to a home, birthright, and identity, is jazz. The basis of jazz, a black contribution to American and world culture, is improvisation, a metaphor for the story of black Americans who have historically had to make a way where none existed before, a way that brought about both the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Movement. Every time a jazz musician improvises a passage, he or she celebrates this history. I embrace the sound and what it stood for, the fleet-footed sweetness of the alto saxophonist Julian Cannonball Adderley, the crusty vulnerability of Ben Webster's tenor sax, the spare melancholy of Miles Davis's trumpet, the sheer might of the original tenor man Coleman Hawkins, the beautiful eccentricity of Thelonious Monk's piano, the deceptive laziness of Billie Holiday's voice, the doggedness and inventiveness of the young Freddie Hubbard as he played trumpet lines over and through the thundering drum beats of Art Blakey, the doggedness and inventiveness necessary for survival for any jazz musician, any black person, anyone at all. And so, in my early 30s, a youngish man and new father to a biracial child, a budding essayist who earned his living as an editor and copy editor, a seeker after cultural knowledge, with Murray in my head and Baldwin in my heart, I set out into the big bad world, reading book after book while strap hanging on my way to and from work, listening at night to those jazz records that were the record of my people's contribution, believing all the while in the rightness of calling myself an American, as years and then 2 decades passed. Along the way, the first black president was elected, which appeared to confirm what I had already decided. Along the way, events may have chipped at the outside of my beliefs. Killings of blacks from Trayvon Martin on through Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, and so many others may have led me to question whether I really wanted to call home a place where the police were seemingly paid to kill people who looked like me. And yet neither Baldwin nor Murray had ever said that I wouldn't have to fight to protect my place in this land I called home. With many others, I took to the streets over those killings and believed I was doing so in service of my country. Perhaps some, black and white, wondered how I could be so even-keeled, and perhaps some, white as well as black, wanted me to be angrier. Some whites in particular appeared to think that I should act through my anger as their conscience. The problem was that I already had a job. I did not have time to be anyone's conscience. And there is a word for one who does others' work for no pay, and I'm not thinking of intern. And so my beliefs at bottom held steady. And then came the election of Donald Trump. For a black man who has based his life on a belief in treating everyone as an individual and on an identification with America, what is the right response to a successful presidential campaign that brought out xenophobia like lava from a volcano? How do I respond to the fact that the majority of white voters, whom I have refused to hate as a group, supported this man? Should I hold on even tighter to the notion of being an American and fight to protect myself and my country from this menace? Or should I distance myself from a country where so many people seem to have demonstrated that they care nothing about me? Is it time to resign my post as the only non-racist black person in America? Or is now, when my principles are sorely tested, the most crucial time to hold on to them? I had arrived at my beliefs with the help of Baldwin and Murray, but I began to sense during this crisis that I needed still another writer, not to give me answers, but to serve as a model for how I might find them on my own. This writer puts me in mind, if this comparison is not too odd, of 1970s TV detectives, the kind with distinguishing characteristics. Only instead of being old like Barnaby Jones, or overweight like Cannon, or paraplegic like Ironside, or blind like Longstreet, or rumpled like Columbo, this writer detective has characteristics you can't see at a glance, and her show, if she had one, would be highly unusual indeed. This writer detective is a woman, yes, but her distinctiveness doesn't even begin there. She is glamorous, wearing dark glasses and dark shoulder-length hair, holding a cigarette and long, elegant fingers, but her thinness and vague air of uncertainty and sadness also make her seem frail. All of that is odd enough in a detective, but it would be during the show's climax that we would see what truly makes her special. This is the part of every program when the detective reveals what really happened, who did the deed and why. As our detective begins to explain, we are struck by the length of her sentences. We think they're about to end, then realize they're just getting started, cohering perfectly for all their complexity and gathering force as they go. They have great power, these sentences, the force and sweep of a flood. But just as a flood is an awesome force carrying along all manner of small objects, these sentences, for all their epic proportions, are full of telling details. And yet even this isn't the astounding part. More startling than the power of our detective's phrasing is what she actually says, which is the opposite of what TV detectives usually say. The mystery, she tells us, gazing straight into the camera, will remain a mystery, because despite all she has learned about it, which is more than most would have uncovered, there are some things no one knows or ever can know, secrets that a few are privy to, but the rest of us never will be. Are you confused by what you've heard and by what you've seen and heard, feeling somehow that it lacks logic or a point? Then, says the detective, you and I together have arrived at the same truth. Who is this writer, this undetective, this well-informed, tragic figure telling us that the more we learn, the less we know? She is Joan Didion. It was because of my own writing that I began to investigate Didion's work. In the 1990s, around the time I started a family, I also began to write essays, many of them published in the Threepenny Review, that discuss books, jazz, film, and painting in relation to my own life, essays that mix the personal with the critical, which I didn't see anyone else doing quite the same way. Here, it seemed, was the purpose of all my obsessive reading, all my late-night sessions of listening to classic jazz after putting the girls to bed, all my mad scribbling of previously unknown film titles, book titles, album titles in my ever-present pocket notebook. Writing about jazz in particular became a way of writing about life's challenges, and a few years later, those pieces, along with personal essays and pieces on books and film, race and identity, made their way into my first book. But how much is truly original? Whatever innovations I may have brought to the form, I knew I wasn't the first writer to inject personal elements into criticism and journalism, or vice versa. And so, wanting to explore what my forebears had done, I began a serious reading of the so-called new journalists with whose work I was casually acquainted. I checked out books by Gay Talese and Hunter S. Thompson. I read quite a bit of Norman Mailer's nonfiction and everything written up to that time by Tom Wolfe. But as much as I enjoyed Wolfe's similes and smart-assedness, Talise's calm eloquence, Thompson's wackiness, and Mailer's sheer ego, there was one writer among this crowd whose work, for me, surpassed the rest. More than any of the others, Joan Didion's essays gave me the sense, for all that some call her inscrutable, of revealing the person behind them, of letting the reader in, as suggested by her oft-repeated phrase, "I want to tell you about." And once, in assessing the character of the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, she might have been talking instead about herself. Quote, "A woman clean of received wisdom and open to what she sees," end quote. Didion's work appealed to me for other reasons, too. Her sadness, her flirtations with a sense of meaninglessness spoke to something in me. I had, I supposed, also reached what the novelist Jane Smiley calls the age of grief, one that perhaps every parent, deep in his or her heart, comes to eventually. In 2006, my wife, my daughters, and I vacationed at a lake house in Maine with 2 other couples and their young children. The setting was gorgeous, the water clear, the air pleasantly crisp and filled with our kids' joyous shouts. Here was the kind of atmosphere that ought to have inspired me, even if it inspired only my contented sighs, but also the kind that can sometimes point up, by contrast, what is wrong. Usually, such beautiful landscapes fill me with a sense of possibility, I wrote in my journal during that vacation in an entry dated August 25th, 2006. I went on to note my old sadness, sense of pointlessness, especially as regards the kids, sadness for them, a feeling of futility for them, end quote. Watching my girls running around outside and having fun with the other kids, which should have made me happy, only gave me the feeling that in the end, their earnest, heartbreaking efforts to do, learn, and grow would pass into oblivion along with their childhoods, would amount to what? In a big world that wouldn't love my children the way I did. In the journal entry, written more than a decade ago now, I can feel my effort to comfort myself, as when I wrote, "The past isn't past. The good memories of childhood, just like the bad ones, are with you always. Nothing is futile, in life or art," end quote. I needed to hold on to something clearly. The first sentence of Didion's essay, The White Album, comes to mind. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. I was trying to allay my worries, but I wonder now if the true cause of those worries about my daughters was that they were being raised and protected in this mean, mean world by me? Surely those wonderful girls deserve someone smarter, stronger, more capable. The happier my children seemed, the sadder their plight appeared to me. Those poor kids blind to the shakiness of their lives' foundations. Somehow, and so far, those girls, now young women, have survived, despite having a father who managed to pass the age of 50 without getting it through his skull what his country really thinks of him. Or is now, when my principles are sorely tested, the most crucial time to hold on to them? Or is this very question a desperate attempt to evade the ugly truth? Is it worse, as twilight approaches, to be a fool or to turn my back on what makes me who I am? In this dark hour, it is the quality of Didion's that she observed in Georgia O'Keeffe, being clean of received wisdom and open to what she sees, that I most need to take on as my own. Given recent events, given daily affirmation that the country I have chosen to identify with has chosen a racist as its leader, how do I continue to live in the only place I have ever called home? To know, it is necessary to take a clear-eyed look at that place, and at myself, as Didion has so many times, and to be open to what I see there, whether or not it is what I hope to find. If anyone seems to understand the problem of getting through one's life without even the most basic knowledge of how, it is Didion. In The White Album, Didion wrote about her seemingly normal functioning during a period of profound personal confusion. Quote, "This was an adequate enough performance as improvisations go. The only problem was that my entire education, everything I had ever been told or had told myself, insisted that the production was never meant to be improvised. I was supposed to have a script and had mislaid it. I was supposed to hear cues and no longer did," end quote. The irony here is that if Didion felt she lacked the ability in her life to improvise, that ability at the heart of jazz, her writing is absolutely jazz-like. And her sentences, phrases riff on one another. Long dependent clauses explore ideas suggested by main clauses, as the work of a jazz horn player explores chords undergirding melody. And in her investigations of topics, Didion gets to the heart of things without knowing beforehand what is there, where she is going. She goes in with her eyes open to what she will find, and she responds accordingly, like a jazz musician responding to what his bandmates are playing, acting in the moment. Now, aching over my empty nest and contemplating the world around me, it is the improvisatory skill and doggedness of the jazz musician and the clear sight of Joan Didion that I hope to bring to this book. Through travel and the one-on-one interviews recorded here, I have even tried to emulate the way Didion sets out to see for herself not what is in her own head, but what is really going on. Okay, so that's the introduction. At this point, I will ask a staff member if they would kindly bring me the glass of water that I unfortunately left behind because I can feel my mouth drying out even as I speak. But okay, somebody's doing that. Okay. Well, while that's being done, I will go into the dreaded chapter 1. Okay. All right. Chapter 1. I refer often in this book to rootedness. What I mean by that word is a sense of stability and security. Oh, God bless you. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. That's much better. Okay. I refer often in this book to rootedness. What I mean by that word is a sense of stability and security based on identification with an entity or idea, a condition that most humans seek, not always consciously, the way water seeks its own level. Rootedness gives us a feeling of belonging, of being part of something greater than ourselves. It often provides the lens through which we view the world, sometimes making us unable to see what is in front of our eyes. The ways that I was rooted for the first 18 years of my life were determined largely by where I grew up. I was born in 1963 and lived for my entire childhood in a semi-detached red brick house in Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood that was totally black. As far as I know, no adult in our neighborhood ever started a conversation with their child by saying, "This place is special because..." But there were certainly things that made us who we were. There was crime, but there was also an unspoken trust. We routinely left our front door and back doors open during warm weather to let in the breeze, along with the sounds of cicadas and the lazy roar of the occasional car going up the street, not worried about who might come walking in. People sometimes did come walking in, but they were mostly neighbors who, in my case, were also relatives, my mother's aunt and uncle, my father's sisters and their husbands, who, like my parents and many of my friends' parents, had made their way to D.C. from farther south, bringing their flat vowels and folksiness. If you were walking down the street in my neighborhood and passed someone, you both spoke, even if you didn't know each other. There was no need to avoid certain blocks because the people there didn't like your kind. Everybody was your kind. Everybody was black. Your teachers, your classmates, the people who sat next to you on the number 40 bus heading out East Capitol Street, the people standing in line at the Safeway at the corner of Division Avenue Northeast and Nanny Helen Burroughs. My memory is selective, the selection process based on no logic I can fathom, but it is also, when it works, long and sharp. I remember, for example, a conversation with a counselor at the summer day camp I attended for 5 years running. The counselor was asking for some reason about my family's socioeconomic status, and he concluded, based on what I said, that we were, quote, lower upper middle class, with which I agreed. That makes me laugh now, as it did you. On a clear day with binoculars, no one in my neighborhood could have seen so much as the sagging bottom of the upper middle class. But my response to the counselor reflected, if not my actual circumstances, then my never having been deprived of anything as far as I knew. And indeed, by the standards of the neighborhood, we were pretty well off. Our house was certainly small. I spent years of my early childhood sharing a bedroom with my grandmother and 2 much older sisters, but we had a house, complete with a backyard and a basement, unlike the residents of the 2 housing projects that sandwiched our block, one of which was home to most of my friends. On the other hand, I remember as a teenager passing the open door of my widowed mother's bedroom, where she sat on the edge of her bed crying because she wanted braces for me and had been told that they would cost between $1,000 and $3,000, which on her salary as a postal clerk on the night shift she couldn't have begun to afford. As a kid then, I was not rich any way you looked at it, but leaving aside the normal stresses of childhood, I did not suffer hardship. I lived in a nurturing environment, and many of my memories are good ones. To this day, to this hour, when I can't sleep, I picture the view from one of the windows at the back of the house. I see the tree in our backyard, through whose limbs and branches slivers of the Lincoln Heights housing project's red brick are visible. In the summer at dusk, when the sky is that special fleeting pastel blue and the breeze caresses the limbs just so, the leaves sway as if moving to a slow tune I can't hear. Everybody in our neighborhood was not only black, but Christian too, so I was a Christian. In our family, unlike some on our block, we did not put on our best clothes on Sunday morning, pile into the car together, and drive off to spend half the day in church. My parents were believers, though, and while we didn't go to church as a family when I was little, my siblings made their way there individually. My older brother to a Baptist church, one of my sisters to the local Catholic church. People's surprise at this makes me chuckle, because they assume that there must have been some acrimonious Catholic-Protestant split in my family, when the truth is that having a Catholic and a Protestant under the same roof was no more significant to us than it would have been elsewhere to have blondes and brunettes in the same classroom. The only real division was between Christians and non-Christians, of whom we knew none. When I was 14 and my mother decided that she and I should start going to church and get baptized, she chose the Catholic church my sister attended, mainly, I think, because it was closest. I went along with this happily enough. I was never fervently religious, but I drew some comfort from faith. I can remember thinking that if my mother died anytime soon, I would be very sad, but it would be okay in the end. I would see her in heaven. So there was rootedness in blackness and religion and the ways that rural folks brought to the city. And then there was one way that my family in particular was rooted, a way that actually did get discussed. I think it applied to our whole family, but it was especially true of one of my sisters. I may have been 8. Phyllis and I were walking home from somewhere. 10.5 years my senior, the youngest of my siblings and the last of them to leave the nest, she often took me with her to various places around the city and in the neighborhood. It was warm out, as I recall, and we were coming down the hill of Division Avenue, our street, passing houses that were small but freestanding, built atop grassy mounds, different from one another, unlike the uniform, semi-detached brick houses of our block. I don't remember how the conversation started, but at one point I said, "They hate us." By they, I meant white people. Phyllis responded calmly. Because she was so much older and taller than me, her words came to me from above, literally and otherwise. "Just remember they're not all the same," she said, or words very much like that, just like we're not all the same. So, our family was not anti-white. I hasten to add that we didn't think white people were special or better than we were. It was simply that we were against prejudice toward anyone. The thinking, I would say, went more or less this way. If racism was a cause of black people's problems, then racism was the very last thing that a black person in particular should embrace. A person was a person, and unless that specific person had wronged you, there was no reason to treat him or her with less than the respect that was due any human being. My family and I were certainly not unaware of or indifferent to white racism. The comment I made at 8 about white people, they hate us, was obviously inspired by something, some observation or overheard exchange I could only make wild guesses about now. But generally speaking, I at least had the sense during that era, the early 70s, when my awareness of the world was taking shape, that things were much better for black people than they had been in a time I couldn't remember. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated just a few years earlier. Part of what I now understand was a backlash against the civil rights era. But I didn't consider his murder as proof of the folly of hope any more than Christians looked on Christ's crucifixion as a reason to suspend their faith in God. King had died for our people, and we were in a new day. It was not that I thought the world was the same place for me that it was for a white boy. During my 20s, I had a conversation with a guy, white and Jewish, with whom I was friends at the time. He told me he remembered his elementary school teacher crying over Watergate. When I asked why was she crying, he seemed surprised and said, "Well, I think common sense would tell you she felt disillusioned that people running the country would do what they did." Actually, for someone who grew up in my neighborhood, common sense would indicate no such thing. To be disillusioned, one must first have illusions, and when it came to the U.S. government, we had precious few. But we did have a sense of hope, or I did. My parents had not been to college, but all 3 of my siblings had, and I took it for granted that I would go too. I never doubted my chances for success. The world was not perfect, but I meant to live in it, treating others with openness and respect until they gave me a reason not to. Nearly half a century later, that belief remains one of the pillars of my thinking. But like an actual pillar that has been exposed to the world for that long, it has seen things get messy around it. College undid much of my rootedness. I was certainly no longer in an all-black environment. Oberlin College, where I enrolled in 1981, had 3,000 students, of whom maybe 200 were black. Then there was Christianity. I am hardly unique in having lost my Christian faith at some point during my college years. The late novelist Maeve Binchy, I recall for some reason, took a trip as a young woman to Israel, where she saw the site of the Last Supper, a trip that seems to have had the opposite of its intended effect, and later told an interviewer about the experience. "One moment I believed a lot, angels with wings and a special Irish God, and the next I didn't believe a word of it." I don't remember an experience like Mitchie's, a single instance of thinking, I just don't believe this stuff anymore. All I know is that I entered college believing that Jesus had died for my sins and left 4 years later not believing anything at all. I remember telling a coworker when I was around 24, I believe in the possibility of everything. That is more or less where I stand now. I think of the time in 2000 when my 106-year-old maternal grandmother lay dying in my sister's house. A visiting nurse told my sister to watch the cat that was hanging around my grandmother's bed. When the cat fled the room, it would be because our grandmother had passed away. The nurse had seen this 100 times. What was the cat running from? I am not offering a guess, merely citing this as an example of things that are hard to explain according to what we currently understand. As I once heard it put, all I can say for sure is that I don't know. And I don't know how anyone else can know either. So I find committed atheists a bit arrogant, though not as arrogant as those who cite their knowledge of God's will in saying that you and your sex partner should not have matching genitalia. This, however, must be said for Christianity, in its purest form, as opposed to its frequent role as a political weapon and a justification for all sorts of exclusion and worse. It is based on an idea, love for our fellow humans, with which only the truly hard-hearted could find fault. When one considers the state of the world, the terrible things people do to one another every day, despite technology that has so much potential for good, one has to be amazed that 2,000 years ago, people who lived in the most rudimentary of ways, who lived poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives, in Thomas Hobbes' famous words, conceived of a philosophy based on the very highest of human ideals. And there is something beautiful, I write this without facetiousness or condescension, in choosing to believe in the symbol of these ideals, choosing a faith that flies in the face of all evidence and is perhaps made for the faithful, all the more vital by that very fact. But I will return to this idea later, much later, and again I was speaking of rootedness. After I left the place where I grew up, I was no longer rooted in an all-black environment, and yet, while that source of rootedness was no more, my having had it helped to reaffirm another source, my opposition to prejudice. Consider this. Some of the most vehement of black separatists I met in college were those who had grown up and gone to school in integrated environments. In their formative and most impressionable years, in other words, they raised their bony brown arms in class, trying to answer teachers' questions, took tentative steps onto the social scene of the cafeteria, tightly and nervously clutching brown paper bags or lunch trays, got their Levi's and sweatshirts muddy and their faces and necks shining with sweat on the football field, and stood in front of mirrors before setting off to those horrible dances, all in the company of white kids who, not because they are white, but because they are kids, are the meanest people on God's earth. People without filters, people who do all manner of cruel things to one another, and who will say, literally, anything. I could make guesses all day about how I would have been affected as a boy by taunts from mean-ass white kids, about how such abuse would or would not have shaped me, but I will never know. Before the age of 18, having gotten to know virtually no white kids, I hadn't had an opportunity to dislike them, and by the time I met them, they were all 18 or older, too. This is not to say that they had been shorn of insensitivity or the potential for racism. It is to say that I was meeting them after they had developed enough sophistication to be admitted to a very good college with a reputation for liberalism, that I was meeting their improved selves, the people they became after the era of schoolyard taunts was over. And my grounding in a solidly black environment, ironically, made me open to them. This rootedness in opposition to prejudice gave me something of a sense of superiority. I hung out with the white kids I met in a dorm I had chosen randomly. And I even had the temerity, mainly because it didn't occur to me to consider it that, to date one of them. When I emerged from my bubble long enough to register that other black students disapproved of all this, their attitudes bothered me, but did not pierce me to the core, because I felt superior to such attitudes, believing that prejudice, all prejudice, was small-minded and simply wrong, and I could not imagine ever feeling differently. Generally speaking, though, as I entered my 20s, I felt my sense of rootedness, which I had taken for granted as one takes for granted the ground beneath one's feet, to be giving way. I no longer lived exclusively or even primarily among blacks, so that source of rootedness was no more. Similarly, I no longer had the comfort of religion. My beliefs in the possibility of everything, and in the rightness of treating everyone as an individual, the latter reinforced by Baldwin's writing, still made sense to me, but after a time they began to seem pretty thin soil in which to root oneself. My white friends, God bless them, never questioned the way I lived, which cannot be said for some of the blacks I knew. These white friends simply let me be myself, and yet, as I laughed and joked in their presence, sitting next to them amid the din of bars or drinking beer from the bottle, while standing among clusters of them at one of those countless dimly remembered parties from my 20s, sometimes a voice whispered, somehow very audibly in those loud gatherings, that I was alone. Then came my discovery of Albert Murray's work, with its emphasis on the integral part of blacks in America, a legacy of grit, resourcefulness, accomplishment, and improvisation, all symbolized by that signature cultural contribution, jazz, my beloved jazz, and all at once I felt rootless no more. I felt like an invisible barrier between me and others, when I had only dimly perceived, melt away, and I relaxed in a way I'd never had as an adult. If anything, I became a little too rooted in Murray's sensibility, in a way that blinded me to what was going on. I got to know Murray personally when I profiled him in 1994 for Current Biography, a publication of the reference book company where I worked then. How am I doing? I later became Current Biography's editor-in-chief. From then until Murray's death in 2013, at age 97, I was an occasional guest at his book-filled apartment on West 132nd Street in Harlem. Murray greatly admired, as did I, those who fought against white racism, and he had a special place of reverence, as did I, for Martin Luther King Jr. But to paraphrase Murray in his book, The Blue Devils of Nada, to fight dragons is heroic, to protest the existence of dragons is naive. In his books and in person, Murray often expressed disdain for those blacks and other minorities who, you might say, purposely led with their chins, placing their status as victims at the center of their art or other work, making the value of that work depend on victimhood, protesting the existence of the dragons, without which their work would have no meaning. I developed my own disdain for what I privately called the victim elite. This was the all but official membership of those who cherished their grievances, stroking them like pampered cats, erecting temples to their own alienation, temples founded every bit as much on exclusion as any Southern good old boys club. Theirs was a kind of thinking that mimicked exclusion instead of fighting it, that led, for example, Terry McMillan to say to the New York Times in 1992, in reference to John Updike's quartet of novels about Harry Rabbit Angstrom, "Who gives a shit about Rabbit?" Well, I did. I happen to love those books. Theirs was a kind of thinking that made them unable to, rightly, champion works outside the white male canon without trashing everything within that canon, sight unseen, along with anyone who had anything positive to say about it. Theirs was a kind of thinking that led them to see no irony in the generalities they made with such abandon, dismissals of whole segments of the population, whites, men, heterosexuals. And theirs was a kind of thinking that led to an exchange I had one day in the mid-1990s. I belonged for a couple of years during that period to a small writing group that met in Park Slope diners and coffee shops. We traded work, all fiction, and sometimes passed around works by established writers that we had found interesting or useful. One week I gave the others a short story I'd written, as well as the story that had inspired it, You Can't Tell a Man by the Song He Sings, from Philip Roth's collection Goodbye Columbus, an early short work infused with elements that attract me to his writing as a whole. The shock of recognition had his characters' quirks and contradictions, the passages that made me laugh aloud. With the two other people who showed up that week, both women, I discussed my story, then tried to talk about the Philip Roth piece. One of the women made a few observations about it. The other said simply, "I didn't read Philip." It was not those 4 words that ended the conversation, but their tone. Hard and dry, like 4 granite walls of a closed-off room containing fixed, unchangeable ideas. It didn't matter that the unspoken rules of our little group obligated her to read the things that other members passed along. It didn't matter that another member of the group had seen something of value in this short story and thought that she and others might too. Her unwillingness to risk being made uncomfortable as a reader and her preconceived notions about Roth, what some assumed from his fiction to be his negative attitude toward women, overrode the rules of our writing group, and so she didn't read Philip. That kind of thinking still drives me crazy. But I now think that my contempt for the fetishization of victimhood interfered with my ability to tell the difference between such self-righteous xenophobia and legitimate complaint. To put it as plainly as possible, I was a good man with a blind spot. I was never indifferent to white racism, and I don't want to suggest that I ever was. All the attention paid during that period to Charles Murray's idiotic book, The Bell Curve, for example, with its 19th century style theories about race and intelligence, nearly made blood come out of my nose. I was not unaware that racism continued to plague the black community. And yet, I understood that black children in poor neighborhoods faced disadvantages from the word go, and I knew about racism in everything from housing to employment to the legal system to environmental health. I knew that kind of racism needed to be fought. I knew it was behind the need to sell drugs, which was behind a lot of the violence. And yet, with no concrete evidence to go on, I wondered if black people should be doing something to help ourselves, something central and crucial, something that had little to do with white racism that we weren't doing. But in any case, there it was, my particular rootedness, which gave me a sense of connectedness to my heritage, allowed me to continue exploring the works of other cultures while feeling secure in my own culture, made me able to operate in the world with confidence, and made me, deep inside, maybe just a little self-satisfied. But there was trouble in paradise, and I will stop there. Oh. Where should I be now? Just here?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right.
If you have a question, we just ask that you please come up to the microphones if you can, so it can be audio recorded.
I have something I could share that might make everybody feel better.
Okay.
The small thing that will get us started, maybe.
Yeah.
Oberlin, class of 52, still on my feet. I went for the first time. Is this working?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For the first time, I went to ALA last year. I'm a lover of children's literature, and I'm working on something of my own before it's too late.
All right.
And I went to the Coretta Scott King breakfast. Mm-hmm. There I was with hundreds and hundreds of librarians. And considering our time, to walk in that room with all those librarians of every variety gave me a great deal of hope. And there was a man there there were a lot of people getting awards. And he was older, not as old as me, but older. Yeah. And he was explaining that it had taken him 8 years to write his book. And then he looked around the room and he said, now this is for my girls. I've got 2 girls. They're 15 and 18 years old. Girls, he said, I can't protect you what you're going to find out there, but I can get you ready. And then he said, and everybody in this room is getting you ready. And I wasn't the only one that felt a little bit of a tear when he said that. Yeah. I never felt better as I was sitting there among all those librarians.
That's
I just
great.
thought I'd share that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You need an arm to lean?
No, I'm all right. I can do it. Somebody, come on, somebody else say something. We don't want to leave him standing up there all by himself.
You can, we can.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Hi,
Yeah.
Cliff. Oberlin, class of 1984.
All right.
So Oberlin seems well represented here. You gave us a great foundation about the beginning of the book, but for those of us who haven't gotten more deeply into it, can you talk a little bit about the traveling you did and the people you talked to and what you took away from it?
Sure. So, as I said, the Donald Trump's election definitely presented a challenge to the beliefs I held, which I just tried to describe in what I read. And so the idea was to try to reconcile my continuing to call myself an American in the face of this situation, which in turn called for trying to understand just a little bit of what people were thinking, right? So I went on good old Facebook. I said, does anybody know some Trump supporters I can talk to, like the kind who wouldn't actually kill me? And as it happened, I have 2 friends in California who said, yeah, come on out here, we'll put you up, and we know people you can talk to. And so sadly, I was not able to. I tried to talk to female Trump voters because I have some real questions I want to ask them. But the others. So the guys I ended up talking to were all over 70, and retired, and I mean, hopefully you'll buy the book and read about this. But what I came away with was not. I mean. Certainly, racism is a force not to be underestimated in our society. But I think that there are other factors at work, and I definitely saw those factors at work in the people I talked to, because they swore up and down that they did not, color was not important to them, and yet with everything they said, it became clear that it was. They just didn't understand it, and so I think there's and. I think what often happens is people see the conditions that Black people face without seeing what has actually created those conditions, and so they just get this sense of this group of people who just can't get it together, not understanding the broader the broader system that is tilted against them. And so there was a lot of that. I ended up identifying, just aside from just like pure straight up racism, I think ignorance is a factor. But the main one I came away with, I think, is indifference. It's not that people hate Black people. It's just that at the end of the day, they may not. They may see that. Donald Trump received the endorsement of the Ku Klux Klan, and they may not like that, but at the end of the day, their own interest or what they think to be their interest just supersede that. So that's a lot of what I came away with.
Yeah. I'm from the Midwest, and I'm struggling with the phenomenon of Christian conservatives who are Trump supporters, and yet they're loving people and supportive of their diversity in their communities. Mm-hmm. In your travels, what observations did you make of that phenomenon, which builds on your discussion with the men over 70?
Right. I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't touch on religion a lot in these discussions. The sense I have is that. Some people see him, he who shall be nameless, as a kind of an imperfect instrument, very imperfect instrument, and again, someone who supports politically what they believe in, even if many other things seem to go against what they would ideally have in a president. So I think there's a lot of like nose holding going on out there among religious people and other people too. That's the best answer I can give you. Yeah. Hey.
So you had said that you wrote the introduction. Forget the mic, here it goes.
Yeah.
But that something changed, and so you were something was revealed by what you had written. So I'm wondering what has changed in your thinking from that introduction to now.
Well, yeah, not so much the introduction as the first chapter, I guess. I guess a deeper understanding of. So when I was, I grew up with the notion that just all prejudice is bad, and I still have that notion. I still will believe that until my dying day. What has changed, I think, is, and I go into this in the book, is a kind of a greater understanding for people who feel differently from the way I feel, and who, I oppose all prejudice. I think all prejudice is wrong, and I call myself an American. These are two things that not every person of color can agree with, and I know I like to think I understand better what that's about, you know, the older you get, the more the less you know. You know, it's you know, I'm not nearly as certain about some things as I used to be. So. Yeah. Oh, here comes somebody. I've never seen this woman before.
Not ever, Brother Cliff. I actually, until I spoke with you about this book, was not familiar with Joan Didion. So
okay.
I'm interested in how you came to discover her and embrace her writings. And I'd like to know whether you think at the end of this book you have done what you set out to do, which is to take a Joan Didion approach to what you were exploring.
Yeah. I think I took it as far as I could. And again, you know, I go into this in the book, but I think that the attempt to look at things exactly as they are, and no matter how that goes against what you want to believe, is the ideal for me. But coexisting with that is the fact that very few of us can get along in the world without being rooted in some belief or other, and often the beliefs that you are rooted in compromise your ability to see things completely clearly. And so I did the best I could. You know, I end up saying that in some ways, for a black person to call him or herself an American and to be opposed to all prejudice is almost illogical in 2019, or we're in 2020 now. And yet, these are the things that I am rooted in. And so I end up, the symbol or metaphor I use at the end is being like a tree. You know, you're rooted, but you are, you know, standing tall enough to kind of see around you and see the things and the people who are not rooted the way you are, and to understand the world in all, you know, in a little more of its complexity. So that's the closest I could come, I would say. You know, I hope Didion would approve. You know.
First of all, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I've been sitting there wrestling with Mr. Murray's Omni-American,
Yeah.
and it's very complex. And
Yeah.
So I hope I'll ask two simple questions. One, what are you imagining his wrestling with, which is not unlike his own time, but now that for the contribution of black effort, black body, black mind, black spirit, black narrative, and so on and so forth, that the persistence of that being rejected, so therefore you don't belong in place, and you have an operational sense of double consciousness. You know, you have possibly a strong sense of self from family and community. Perhaps you have a life of success in some measure, but again, you're day in and day out, you have to wrestle with beyond victimhood, you're an unwelcomeness, and it's certainly psychologically and culturally unsettling. So, what would you imagine Mr. Murray to be wrestling with?
Like if he were around now, you mean? Oh boy. I'm thankful actually that Murray died in 2013. So he missed the most recent presidential election, and I'm grateful on his behalf that he did. You know, I asked myself that question too. You know, I mean, I got to know Murray fairly well over the course of almost 20 years, and I don't think. I mean, I think he was so grounded in what he wrote about and talked about that I really don't think. I think he would have gone down with the ship. You know, I think he would have said, "Look, this. You know, there's a dumbass in the White House. So what? You know, that does not change. Yeah, that does not change. Yeah. Because you know, he used to call it an ancestral imperative. You know, this is what your ancestors have done so that you can be here, and it is on you to continue this journey. And I really think, you know, he would have he would have continued doing what he was doing, basically. Yeah. So.
Forgive me for not standing up because of my sore knee, but I'll just say to you that I thought that your interviews with the Trump supporters were hilarious. And I wondered if you had that sense while they were happening. And if you, I mean, obviously you would have had to hide that, right?
Yeah. Well, hilarious is not. I mean, in retrospect, I guess they were. You know, it's funny. I
In moments of comedy, they were high comedic moments.
Oh, it was unintentional humor for sure. You know, it's funny. I don't like to generalize about like different groups of people, but it has been interesting just like talking to the people I know who've read my book, and it's like, you know, a number of white people who read the book say, "Wow, those interviews were just fascinating. I learned a lot." And the black friends I have are like, that was painful. Like, how did you sit there through that? And so I mean, I was not laughing at the time, and I know, yeah. There were definitely moments of, you know, I asked one of the interviewees what he thought about Barack Obama, and inwardly, I mean, I knew this was not going to be a fun answer, so I just kind of like girded myself and like tried to keep a straight face and the whole thing, and just listen with a straight face and not you know, get mad or throw up or anything like that. I mean, with distance it becomes funnier, but it's not really fun. It's not really funny, you know. Yeah, and I know you know that. Yeah. Hey.
Hey, thanks, Cliff, and congratulations.
Thank you.
But to kind of follow up on the question, have you been in touch with the gentleman since? Have they read the book? Have you been in touch? Have you had a reaction from them?
It's like I should have been. It's like a point of honor. I should have been. I have not really. I did some follow-up questions with them for the book. As far as I don't know if they've read the book or not. I don't actually know. One of these days, you know, I'm going to get around to sending out copies and saying, you know, and then changing my address and, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
And then the other question I had was, I mean, that was, you know, sort of heartbreaking reading at the beginning about, you know, what you thought about your daughters in Maine when you were kind of just thinking about the future. Have you talked to them about that, or have you had a conversation about that, or, you know, what was
about the
about that moment, or, you know?
Oh, well, they've both read the book. Yeah, it's funny you say that. I mean, the period I was talking about was the mid 2000s, and since then, you know, since my daughters have they're now like 21 and over, and what I've come to understand is that it's funny. I have a daughter who's 26 and one who's 21, and in some ways they may as well belong to different generations, because I feel like somewhere in those 5 years, something has been lost that I grew up with, and I think people who came after me, which is the sense that as imperfect as things are, they're you know, we're on a slow road to improvement, and I don't think my 21-year-old thinks that at all. And that is a hell of a thing to grow up without. And I feel terrible for this generation. At the same time, I think they're mobilized in a way that, or at least a lot of them are, in a way that we were not, or at least I was not. So I mean, it's a grim picture, but I think there is hope, and I think it rests with them. You know. Yeah.
All right, that's all the time we have. I just want to say thank you very much. Oh,
thank you all for coming. Hey, Kirk.
We have time for one very quick question.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Yes. So I've had the pleasure to read the book, and late in the book you say some more about the issue of sort of ultimate belief. You use the word faith, and I understand you're not a Christian anymore, but you talk about, in effect, you're having to dig down and decide, I have a faith in the equality of everyone.
Right. Yeah.
Could you say more about that process of searching?
Sure. I mean, it sort of relates to what my answer to my sister's question a few minutes ago, which is that it is very difficult to get through your life without faith in something, you know. If Bob Dylan had a song, you know, you've got to serve somebody, right? You know, and it's the same idea in a way. It's like, and so even as you understand that this thing you believe in, sometimes you look at it and it doesn't seem to make all that much sense, but you have the necessity to hold on to something, and these are the things I hold on to, you know. And it's a contradiction, you know. You try to look at the world as it is and things as they are and yourself as you are, but that is sort of contradicted by the need to hang on to something. And I think the challenge is to resolve those two things. And that's where I came up with the sort of tree analogy. You know, you're rooted, but you're standing tall and you can kind of see around you. So you can have, you know, one foot in objective reality and the other in the things that kind of anchor you to to yourself, to the world. So that'd be my answer, I guess. So, yeah. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.